Hi everyone, my name is Lisa and I'm from the Connected Intelligence Center at the University of Technology, Sydney. This video is about student belonging. Belonging has always been a topic of interest in higher education. This is because of its close association with students' engagement and their learning experience at university. Today, it has risen again in prominence due to global events affecting the way that education is delivered and therefore experienced by students, especially in terms of community and equity. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions. What do you know about whether your students feel a sense of belonging? What information do you typically use to make a judgment about whether your students are struggling with this affective aspect of their engagement? Secondly, when do you get this information? Is there time to intervene by the time you receive this information? In this video, my colleagues Simon Buckingham-Shum, Peter Felton, and Jennifer Uno address the central challenge of understanding students' sense of belonging over time and at scale. To address this challenge, we present a proposal for data-informed approaches to understand and support students' belonging in personalized and timely ways. We call this set of approaches belonging analytics, and we share examples of such belonging analytics in the next section of this video. And I'm going to move the time over to Peter and Jen to talk about belonging.
Thanks. And I think I'm going to kick it off and talk a little bit and introduce some ideas about belonging. And belonging really is, it's very complex and it is multifaceted. And as Joan mentioned earlier, it kind of is everywhere right now. I read an article on the Chronicle just the other day where they said that there were some 60 job postings this last year that had the word belonging in the title of the job. And that's up 23 from previous years. And so I think it really does highlight a shift in thinking in higher education and the recognition of the importance of belonging. Because we do know that belonging really does increase the positively or show positive interactions with the successful transition into higher ed. And Simon, if you could advance the slide for me. Thanks. We know that students' sense of belonging are positively linked to successful transition into higher education. We know that it helps with persistent graduation rates, as well as increased academic performance. And on the heels of the pandemic, it increases mental health and well-being. And while we don't really have a great blueprint yet for belonging, there are sort of two parts that we can think of when we think of the definition of belonging or how we look at belonging in higher ed. And one is, if you can advance the slide. When we look at belonging, we look at it sort of in two ways, the sense of value and fit. If we can go ahead and advance as well there. So students need to feel valued, that they are accepted and needed in an environment, and that they fit, that their characteristics are shared or complementary with those around them. And in fact, if you look, we move to the next slide, we'll kind of look through a model of belonging. Next slide. That belonging really is rooted in context and time, meaning that it can shift. And a student's sense of belonging or belonging uncertainty, which is a general concern or about the quality of one's social relationships or not belonging, if you will. It is contextual and it can shift, right? So you can have a student that fits in the context of a university. If we can go ahead and advance. That there are multiple levels, that you can have a student that feels like they belong on campus, but maybe perhaps does not feel that sense of belonging within their major or even within a specific classroom.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up, and just to reinforce something Lisa said early on, feel free to jump in the chat too and put questions or comments or things like this. So as Jen said, belonging is really correlated with lots of very positive things for undergraduate experiences. And there's strong research that says what institutions do, what faculty and staff do at institutions can influence students' sense of belonging. But there's at least two challenges related to belonging that seem really important for us as we think about belonging in analytics. The first one is the issue of fit. And just three brief points on this. First, if you look at the research on belonging in the United States, it's really quite consistent and fairly distressing that if you look at students of color at predominantly white institutions in the United States, really the data is very consistent that these students do not report that they feel like they belong at the same rate as their white peers. And so that the construct of belonging here might not be the ideal construct when thinking about all of our student populations. And this is not only true in the United States. Simon, if you could go to the next one. This is a line from a recent paper by a colleague, Karen Gravitt from the UK, and Ajawi, who is from Australia. And what they point out is that there are students in many contexts who either don't wish to belong or cannot feel like they ever will belong in a higher education context or in a certain academic program. And so belonging is problematic around this issue of fit. In other words, belonging has sort of an assimilatory pressure. In other words, to really feel like you belong, you need to fit in. You need to assimilate into the context. And that's really problematic for quite a number of students. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So one more click here. There is some new research. I'm part of this research, but there's other research like this going on in the UK that's trying to look at alternatives to belonging. And the idea here is not to throw belonging out, but to say the research on belonging is very strong with lots of positive connections to learning and well-being and persistence and whatnot. But maybe we can cultivate all of that positive stuff without the assimilating pressure of fit. And the contrasting construct that's being used by some scholars in the UK and in the US is the sense of mattering, which really takes one half of what we're defining belonging as, or how belonging is commonly defined, which is it's leaving out the fit and it's keeping in the sense that you're a valued member of the community. In other words, that someone in this community cares about your presence, values your voice, thinks that what you have to contribute and who you are matters in that setting. The line here and the citation here is from a new study of students of color, mostly first-generation students of color, almost all low-income students of color at 3 higher ed institutions in the United States, a community college and 2 highly selective liberal arts colleges. And what we show in this is that most of these students don't see themselves as fitting in their institution. In fact, some of them see it as resisting assimilation in the institution as being something that's empowering for them. So part of the problem with looking at belonging, perhaps, is that if we see a student who expresses a lot of belonging uncertainty or says they don't belong, would say that student is at risk for not succeeding. Some of the research on that, or at least some students of color in the United States, not belonging is sort of a mark of their success. And so they see that as part of a motivating factor. So maybe it's too simple to just say belonging good, not belonging bad. So there's this issue of fit in belonging, which is problematic. The second challenge with belonging that we want to tease out here briefly, and Simon, if you could skip to the next slide, has to do with the data. And there's really 3 issues here. Amelia Parnell's talk earlier today sort of teed up some of these. One of them is that the most common way to get a sense of whether students have a sense of belonging or not is to use self-reported surveys, like the PSSM, which was developed for elementary and middle school children, but it's been adapted for higher ed and used for decades. If you want to dig more into measuring belonging, I strongly recommend the Lingat and et al. Paper, which is quite recent and quite good. So we have survey data, which we always have issues with survey data of response rates, but also it's capturing just a particular moment in time. And as Jen said, belonging is contextual and belonging is time bound. So looking at a particular moment of time in the past may not be a great way to use or to understand students' actual sense of belonging in context. A second way scholars have looked at belonging is using student narratives. These can be interviews, these could be reflective writing and things like this, the problem with this this data is really rich. It's really nuanced. It can be very powerful, but it's very labor intensive to gather, very labor intensive to use. So that gets to this sort of core problem with data, which is the third click here, please, Simon. And it's what Amelia Parnell was talking about earlier, which is really the issues around having data that we can use at scale, that is contextually appropriate, and that is useful for faculty, staff, institutions, and particularly for students, so that they can understand their own experiences and use that to benefit their education. So that's the big picture, walking you into what we mean by belonging, why this is a powerful construct, but perhaps not ideal, but still powerful. Now we're going to turn it over
to the next part, where we're going to share a little bit about our own proposal, how we see that learning analytics can contribute to this area to address belonging. All right, so we're going to introduce something called the ADF framework. So ADF stands for Agents, Data, and Feedback. So when we talk about agents, I'm just going to talk about the data first, because as Simon mentioned, the data is really, well, in terms of for learning analytics, data is the oil for learning analytics. So what are the kinds of data that typically is used in learning analytics? We do have student self-report, student artifacts, and activity data traces. In terms of the analytical agent, what we're talking about is who actually looks at the data and makes meaning out of it in order to do something with it. So we have, typically it's the educator, and sometimes the student, and with advances in technology and in data science methods, we have more of the computer as the agent to look at that data and quickly come up with, quickly use algorithms to make sense of that data and feed that into interventions. So typically, conventionally, humans are the ones who give that feedback, and it's usually the educator through written forms or even verbal feedback. It could be praise, it could be feedback on how students are doing with their assessments, with their writing, feedback on students' self-reports, like when you get a survey, the educator can give an overview of the findings from that survey. And in terms of activity data traces, well, we can see there's a real gap here, because firstly, it's rare for students to analyze their students' log data, and the educator rarely has time to look into those activity data traces as well. So if we can go on to the next slide. So here now in this table, we see the possibilities arising from learning analytics, some of the ways that learning analytics has approached data, and we're actually proposing that some of these can be ways, approaches towards addressing belonging. So I'm not going to cover everything in the green squares, but I'm just going to talk with Simon, and I are just going to step through a few of these to give you a flavor of starting to work towards this idea of analytics for belonging.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. All right, so we're going to step through a few glimpses of approaches that we think seem to show some promise for illuminating concepts around belonging. They're quite diverse, and they cover different parts of that design space that we just showed you. Okay, here's first one. Work at Georgetown University, as many of you will know, a small elite university right in the heart of DC. Attracts, a particular socioeconomic demographic. You have to be pretty wealthy to go there unless you get a scholarship. They were aware that there were certainly issues around culture and belonging, and they gathered micro narratives, little stories from first-generation undergrads of their experiences of belonging and alienation. And you will see why we are calling this participatory narrative analytics in a moment. But going back to Peter's earlier point, stories are important. Here's one of the stories in the report. I'll give you the link to this. It's a great report. So, the problem here is that the academic made a big deal about learning everybody's names, but when he got to this woman's name, and she knew that it was a hard name to say for a non-Spanish speaker, he didn't even attempt to say her name. He sort of moved on, and from then on, never ever sort of tried to learn her name, and just sort of pointed to her in the classroom when he wanted her to speak or whatever. So pretty negative story there. And we were talking in our breakout group about teaching practices. This can't just be something that's outsourced to the student affairs, co-curricular activities. That's social belonging, but to have a sense of academic belonging and that you even belong in this classroom is important. That was a negative story. In the report, they talk about positive stories as well. They had a conference for first-gen low-income students who celebrated their identities. Great sense of solidarity. We continue to be fearless, unapologetic, and determined. And so there you go. Awesome event for building that sense of mattering without assimilating. Okay, so you may well have done something like this, but this, if you haven't, then it's something to consider compared to a survey. You gather stories. Okay, you could simply create yourselves a website to elicit these micro narratives. The SenseMaker platform from the Cynefin company is one such platform. Nothing exciting about this. It's a web form which encourages you to share stories. You know, think of a meaningful time you felt a part of or not a part of Georgetown. Please describe what happened. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is that the student tells their story, and then they are asked to drag the red dot to the right place in the triangle. So the prompt here is, if there was support, it came from, and there are 3 sources of support, and the student drags the dot to wherever they feel it best locates. Okay. So it's participatory and agentic because the student is the only one who's coding here. We are doing citizen coding of their stories. Okay, you get 300 students or whatever to do that. And of course, you've suddenly got quantitative statistical clustering going on. So if we look at another cluster map now, triangle, if there was alienation in my story, it came from 1, 2, or 3. Okay, and we can start to see the pattern in the community. If I felt discouraged to turn to my family for support at the time of my story, it was because they wouldn't understand. I feel responsible for handling this. I didn't want to burden them. Okay. Obviously, the research team or the team who are shaping the analysis decide what these terms would be, or maybe they would be co-designed with the students. I'm not sure how they did it. You could be even more participatory and co-design what these apex labels would be. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that as one example where we've got rich, thick data, qual data, but we're transitioning into quant analytics. And the links here will take you to that report in much more detail. Obviously, our slides will be available afterwards. Lisa.
Just moving on from the stories, the narratives that that students tell as a rich source of data, there's also another methodology that is typically used in learning analytics, and that's social network analysis. So when we talk about belonging, you can't help but talk about relationships because really, as Peter mentioned, relationships are key to belonging. So you really have to look at relationships. And so social network analysis is a really useful and powerful way to understand these relationships in a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples that highlight this, the insights that can be gained. So work by Jennifer McCabe. She used social network analysis in a kind of manual way. So she got students to basically write down on a pen, using pen and paper, of who were their friendship groups. And through her work, if you, Simon, if you could just take the next clip, two diagrams, yeah. So through her work, she found these different types of social networks. And the key thing to take away really was this idea of multiplex relationships. So relationships where students, and not just friendship groups, but also friendship groups that where they learn together, they work together. And these were found to be really powerful to help students thrive and really build this, working towards the sense of belonging. The next slide, please, Simon. So more recently, we have work by Feldner Phil. So this researcher has actually taken furthered the work of Jennifer McCabe and just really showed more clearly using the same methodology to show that what they showed was really that multiplex networks are really important for students to thrive. But if you look at that fourth diagram, they're so sparse. So really, we're seeing that students, especially particular students, there are particular groups of students who are not benefiting from multiplex relationships because they don't have the opportunity. And it could be just simple reasons because they are commuting. So they haven't been able to build up those relationships, those important relationships, which will really foster belonging. So this is really something that with these findings, we can really start to address in really targeted ways how to I guess find out more about how students are feeling about their relationships and address that at a very personal level. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. All right, moving swiftly on, we're just doing a whistle-stop tour here through a number of examples that we can come back to discuss. Okay, we hear a lot about knowledge and skills, but we're paying a lot of attention to dispositions. And these are the habits of mind that students bring, their whole orientation and appetite for stretching themselves outside of their comfort zone. And I'm showing you work here from over 20 years work by Ruth Deacon Crick. There's one of the references at the bottom you can chase up, who has been developing a multidimensional construct called learning power. You can read about that on our website. Essentially, you do a survey. So it's a good old survey, nothing very high tech going on here, but obviously the questions have been, and the constructs underlying it have been through a lot of validation. And you can see the kinds of questions that are asked here on the left, from which the student then immediately receives a personalized spider diagram, which shows them how they see themselves as a learner, right? That's all this is. We're holding up a mirror to the learner. This is not some objective 360-degree assessment or anything. This is how you see yourself as a learner, and accompanying that are personalized reports with a whole array of things to think about, ways to talk to groups of peers. We can scaffold conversations between students and so forth. Now, one of those dimensions is belonging, and you can look at this paper to learn more about the underlying construct of belonging in this survey. But you can see along with that a whole range of dispositions that we are seeking to cultivate in our students here at UTS. And we've been working with this approach since about 2016. So I just wanted to show you that. It's a self-report approach, but it's a learning analytics approach in the sense that we take that data and immediately turn it around and feed back to the student. This isn't just disappearing into some research survey database that the student never hears from again. This is all about working with your profile, making aspirational stretches on that profile, and then working on, for example, creativity in the context of your course curriculum assignment. The next example I wanted to show you was using text analytics. Text is obviously a huge window into the mind of the learner, and we've been doing a fair amount of work here at UTS on writing analytics, and particularly reflective writing analytics. So we think there's the potential to detect salient features in students' reflective writing about their sense of belonging or alienation. I need to say we haven't done a systematic evaluation of the performance of this tool on that kind of belonging writing, but we have been analyzing other kinds of reflective writing in quite a lot of detail. The web app we've developed takes a piece of draft writing from the student and annotates it when it can see these kinds of these hallmarks of good reflective writing. Okay, their thoughts and feelings about a significant experience, something that was challenging for them or surprising, running into unfamiliar ideas, problems, or learning experiences, talking about themselves in detail. Of course, this is not third-person analytical persuasive argumentation. This is first-person writing about my experiences and how I'm feeling, and potentially how I'm changing, how I might deal with a situation differently next time this comes up, for example. Okay, so those of you who are used to reflective writing in your teaching practice will be familiar with this sort of thing. So I pasted in an example from the Georgetown case study just to see how it went. You know, this is not a scientific piece of research I'm presenting to you. I just tried this yesterday just to sort of point to the potential. Okay, so here's a piece of reflective writing from Georgetown. And it's flagging certain sentences as you can see from the icons. This is what it looks like to the student when it comes back. I think there's potentially something that we could explore further with reflective writing analytics, because we're all sitting on a lot of textual data, but making sense of it or feeding it back to the student as well. So you might be seeing this as an opportunity to help students reflect on how they are dealing with their experiences as well. Another study at Johns Hopkins was using reflective writing by medics, but they were doing that from the perspective of the educators, to try and get a sense of the overall balance of reflection in the student cohort. Okay, enough of that. And you get feedback as well if you're using this as a tool to actually cultivate reflective writing skills. Far more that we could say about that, and we can return to that later. Okay, ping-ponging back to Lisa.
So next thing that I'm going to talk about within the ADF framework that we've been doing quite a bit of work on here at UTS as well, but in other places, we do know that to foster belonging, there is that relational element. So we're looking at, and we can see that actually feedback is a key way that lecturers, academics can engage with their students to build those relationships, especially personalized feedback. So we know that the challenge of being able to give personalized feedback, even just tailored to the student's name. So we saw that even knowing the student's name, especially when you have a large and diverse cohort, it's going to be challenging. So Learning Analytics has, through the research, has been developing tools for automated feedback. And one of those tools that is currently being used is a tool called OnTask. So Simon's pointing to that link there. And what OnTask does is to help the academic to scale personalized feedback and tailor it based on students, things like the student name, and to their individual learning progress, their performance. And this happens not at the end of the course, which typically is, where you find out about students, but along the way. So Learning Analytics actually affords the opportunity it gives insights to students' progress, how they're doing over the course of their studies. And so academics can monitor that and turn that data into feedback. So as you can see here in this example, how the tool works, the academic can create rules based on students' data. So in this case, we have students' performance data, whether they got a low score on a quiz or a high score, and the academic can create some warm feedback back to the students to acknowledge their performance, to feedback how they've done, and more importantly, to offer that kind of support and actionable advice. So this is an example of where mattering comes in. So through the messaging of the feedback, academics can convey that sense of mattering. I really like this example because this is one of the ways that that message can be framed. So you can see the academic says, we believe that you can be successful in your studies. So it's not just something like, hey, you didn't do well, you better buck up, and you've not been doing well all this time. Rather, it's this idea that they can do it, that they matter, and more importantly, also that that the academic is there to support. And you can see from the feedback, so at the end of every course, we get feedback to from the students to know how they have experienced it, because we need to know whether it's making a difference to them. So we are starting to see that there is an impact on belonging when the academic reaches out in this way. As the student has said, it was good that the faculty is taking as much interest as I am in taking the subject. It's personalizing the subject and focusing on me. So this is a really strong evidence, although it's just one student, but we're hoping to see more of this as we gather more data. Students can see that they matter because the academic is actually taking the time to create, to craft that feedback, to take notice of how they're doing and to support them in a very personalized way with a belief that they can, that they can succeed. And so I think this really deals with a couple of challenges. Firstly, it's that challenge of big cohorts. So with learning analytics through this tool actually allows academics to reach out to all their students in a very personalized way. Just even knowing their name, knowing about their progress and offering support, letting them know that they matter. In this video, we have outlined a few learning analytics approaches to the challenge of belonging within the framework of belonging analytics. Based on advances in the field of LA, these approaches offer new ways of monitoring and supporting student belonging in timely and personalized ways, drawing on different sources of data. Certainly, we recognize the importance of ensuring that data sources that are used to inform belonging are firmly grounded in theories of belonging, and that analytical approaches take these into consideration, especially the notion of equity. We invite practitioners and researchers who are interested to join us in a collective inquiry into this new era. Thank you for watching.